Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today, this is episode number 121. Well, officially is number 120 as episode 100 was never recorded since it overlapped the events of October 7, and it was certainly not the time to celebrate the accomplishment of Jerusalem Unplugged. The podcast will take now a break with the end of season 5, while I will try to put together new interviews, invite new guests, and rethink the structure and contents of Jerusalem Unplugged. But in the meantime, please enjoy the interview I recorded with Oren Kroll-Zeldin, who is the author of Unsettled, American Jews and the Movement for Justice in Palestine, published by New York University Press in 2024. Oren is the Assistant Director of the SWIC program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco, where he is also an Assistant Professor of Theology and Religious Studies. His book is an ethnographic study of activists, including himself. And his thesis is that young American Jewish activists, roughly speaking between the age of 18 and 40, engage in Palestine solidarity work to express their Jewish identity. They understand Jewish values as demanding a deep commitment to social justice that necessitates distancing themselves from Israel and Zionism. They are active in 4 main groups, which are discussed for the podcast, If Not Now, which protests mainstream Jewish institution support for Israel, All That's Left, and the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which try to engage diaspora Jews in co-resistance actions with West Bank Palestinians, and Jewish Voice for Peace, an anti-Zionist organization that promotes the boycott, sanction, and divestment, BDS, movement against Israel. So this book, this interview, may not be a comfortable read or listen for older generation of American Jews, but it describes a phenomenon that is real and happening right now. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Oren, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you.
So can you tell us something about yourself first, and more importantly, about the origins of the book?
Absolutely. I'm very much a subject in my own book. This is an ethnographic project, but it's also very much autoethnographic. I grew up in a Jewish community in Los Angeles, a very much normative Jewish community in a Reform household. And I went to a Jewish day school and participated in Jewish youth groups. I went to a Reformed Jewish overnight summer camp. So I very much had the mainstream experience of what it means to be an American Jew, and certainly in terms of how I learned about Israel and Zionism. I am a professor at the University of San Francisco in the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. It's the only academic program in the country that formally links these two fields, Jewish Studies and Social Justice. And this book very much is rooted in the pedagogical underpinnings of our program, of what I do in the classroom. But when I was in the classroom and doing teaching and research, I became very, very interested in understanding how younger American Jews are shifting their views in very profound and meaningful ways when it comes to the state of Israel and Zionism, I started to then think about myself and my own experiences. And that's when I decided this is a research project that's worthy of inquiry, and I wanted to do something that would make a contribution to the movement to help render intelligible, in a sense, the pretty large presence of Jews in the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the United States.
And certainly that has become very visible after the events of October 7 and the current war in Gaza that maybe we're going to discuss at the end, wrapping up our discussion. Now, the book starts with the events of 2021, and it investigates how young American Jews reacted and how they challenged the American Jewish establishment for that round of violence, which seems like a long time ago, but it was only literally 3 years ago. So can you tell us more about the goals of the book and the main actors that you discuss throughout your narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. I started with 2021 because at the time when I was writing, it was the most recent intense conflagration of violence. Only the most recent. And that's also at this point, as you noted, very outdated. And there have been multiple conflagrations. But for me, what happened in 2021, it was one of many sort of mobilizing moments, cataclysmic episodes that shook the foundation of American Jewish life. And I saw that a group of rabbinical students wrote an open letter to their rabbinical schools and to their broader communities saying, we condemn the violence of the Israeli military. We condemn Israeli policies of occupation and apartheid. And we're the future leaders of the Jewish community. And we need to be taken seriously in terms of how we approach Israel and Zionism. So in the book, I focus on young American Jews, millennial and Gen Z activists who are active participants in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I focused specifically on 4 groups: on If Not Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and All That's Left. All 4 of these are organizations or collectives that in various ways participate in robust and meaningful ways in Jewish contexts in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And I also focused on each of these groups because each of them focuses on a different method or tactic with regards to their activism. If Not Now, their primary tactic or strategy is to target mainstream American Jewish communities in the United States to say we need to shift our approaches to Israel, and they're working to get these institutions to be more inclusive of Palestinian narratives and to speak out against Israeli state violence. The Center for Jewish Nonviolence and All That's Left collective are working on a strategy called co-resistance, where Palestinians and Jews resist together on the ground in Israel-Palestine and engage mostly in direct actions to change the status quo and shift the status quo on the ground. And Jewish Voice for Peace engages in boycott, divestments, and sanctions. They're the most prominent Jewish group involved in the BDS movement. And I identified these 3 tactics as meaningful ways that young American Jews in particular participate in Palestine solidarity activism.
I'm curious about 2 characters that you discuss in the book, Peter Beinar and Dov Waxman. Now, maybe listeners may be familiar with these names, maybe not, so it's worth mentioning who they are. And there are 2 main figures that you discuss at the beginning of your work. Beinart, who himself has changed radically his views, noticed that many young American Jews abandoned Zionism as in contradiction with their liberal values. While Dov Waxman, on the other hand, talks about critical engagement with Israel. And this is very much his academic and scholarly work. Can you elaborate more on these points? Now, in particular, they relate to your book.
In 2010, Peter Beinart wrote what at the time was a groundbreaking essay about the American Jewish community and Zionism. And he said exactly what you noted, that at some point, young American Jews would start checking their Zionism at the door, because it doesn't match up with their liberal views that they were actually taught, for the most part, in the Jewish institutions that they might one day abandon because of those institutions' unfettered approach towards Zionism. My research is providing qualitative data to say he was right. He was 100% right. The more young American Jews learned about the realities of Israel, the realities of the impacts of Zionism and its policies on Palestinians, they would realize this doesn't match up with our values, our ethics, our morals. And we can no longer be part of these American Jewish institutions that blindly support Israel because it doesn't work for us. And what we see happening is that he was quite prophetic about. They're leaving these organizations, but they're not leaving these organizations and not engaging in Jewish life anymore. Instead, they're creating their own meaningful ways of engaging with Jewish life. And one of the ways they do that is through Palestine solidarity activism. So that's when we see the development of a group like If Not Now. Instead of running away from Jewish communities, they create a community that works for them. And that really fulfilled, in a sense, what Peter Beinart was talking about. Now, as you noted, Peter Beinart himself went through a very dramatic shift, personal transformation, where he left his liberal Zionism behind in many ways and is very outspoken on a binational state and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So he himself has come a long way alongside these other activists that he was talking about that would one day leave Jewish institutions. Dov Waxman is a really important political scientist who wrote a book that was published in 2016 called Trouble in the Tribe, all about American Jewish communities, intracommunal strife about Israel and Zionism. He came up with a really important idea of critical engagement that said young people today are not moving away from Israel. They're not saying Israel is no longer important to us. And as some social scientists were in Jewish studies were lamenting the fact that young American Jews were moving away from Zionism and engagement with Israel, he said, actually, they're not really moving away from Israel. They're just engaging with it in a different sense, and that is in a critical way. They're still caring about Israel. They're still participating in the American Jewish community and conversations around Israel and Zionism. They're just doing so through criticizing Israel, through criticizing Israeli politics and Israeli policies. And they're unlearning some of the myths that they were taught, but not running away. Instead, saying, well, we can change this. We can engage in a more critical way. And they talking to the leaders of Jewish institutions, saying, change things and we'll engage with you in different ways. So this idea of critical critical engagement was really important for understanding the social science behind how American Jews relate to Israel in uh, more contemporary times.
We can say that Peter Beinart was on the road to Damascus, or perhaps to the West Bank, and eventually went through some personal deep transformation, which is an interesting phenomenon that happened to many. I'm thinking about a number of people, even journalists and commentators. I remember journalists from Fox News, Geraldo Rivera. Now, one more question about methodology and terminology, because I think this is very important. Can you tell us a little more about the way you structured your research and writing? But I'm also interested in the question of key terms, because you are talking about occupation, apartheid, and these are very contested terms as we speak. So can you tell us a little bit more about your definition of these key terms?
When I started doing the research for this book almost a decade ago, I set out to try to understand the role of what I then called anti-occupation activism among young American Jews. I was involved with a lot of activism myself on the ground in Israel, Palestine, mostly, less so in American Jewish communities. But I really saw most people articulating this as anti-occupation activism. So by occupation, I was referring to the Israeli rule over the territories taken in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. I'm not focusing here on the occupied Golan because that's not where Palestinians were living. So I was thinking about anti-occupation in the sense of how people are working to end the Israeli occupation of those three Palestinian territories. It became clear to me over time that uh, that was not language that a lot of activists were using anymore. More often than not, I heard people articulate their work as anti-apartheid activism or as activism that was against occupation and apartheid and putting those two things together. Now, I've staked my claim on the apartheid debate in other scholarly writing that I have done, but in this book, I write about apartheid becoming part of the language of Jewish American activists mostly in 2019 and 2020 as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, three major human rights organizations, published reports about Israeli apartheid and started to codify that into the language of activist communities. I should say that Palestinians have been referring to what's been happening in Palestine as apartheid for decades, and many people not in Palestinian scholarly or activist communities weren't listening, weren't willing to use that terminology. But in the last 5, 6 years, as more and more human rights groups started to use that language, wrote these reports, codified it into the public discourse, more and more people who are activists are using it. At this point, I, in a sense, use these two words interchangeably. Occupation, certainly there is a military occupation in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. The policies that Israel's using in these territories, to me, is very clearly very clearly is apartheid as we can understand it based on the international legal definition of the Apartheid Convention And so this is both my language, but also activist language and the language of human rights organizations around the world.
I'm sure many already disagreed with you and will disagree with you looking at the narrative of your book and your definitions. But I think you clarified, and uh, I think, personally, it's very important to highlight that these terms does not come out of the blue, but is supported by evidence both on the ground, but also from legal definitions and also definitions that have been created for the protection of the rights of others, humans. Now, I want to move to the first chapter of the book, which is a very dense one. And so I'm trying to merge a few questions here. Obviously, the chapter opens with the events of 2014, which marked the beginning of one of the numerous confrontation wars that affected Gaza. And you start talking about the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which you mentioned earlier. So I was wondering if at first you can tell us a little bit more about the Jewish participations in Palestinian, Palestine solidarity activism. But I'm also interested to understand, the questions of the different kind of activism that you can see from the other side. In other words, when we think about the election of Donald Trump in 2016, we also saw a reaction against the Palestine Solidarity Movement. So it's not only the left working, but you also have the other side. And perhaps in all of this, you can just give us a sense, a glimpse of the stories of some of the organizations that are involved, like you mentioned earlier, if not now, or Jewish Voice for Peace. And perhaps for those who are interested also in more academic terminology, you also talk about the intersectionality of this movement. And I know this is a lot, but perhaps you can bring about, what it means, intersectionality in this context and how these organizations come across with each other.
I'll try to respond to that by connecting a few strands. There is a lot there. Okay, so let's start with the intersectionality with regards to the Palestine Solidarity Movement more broadly. First of all, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I like to think of it as an ecosystem. There are many different organizations and groups and individuals and strategies that all work together towards a broader goal, and that is justice and liberation for Palestinians. What justice and liberation looks like is different for those individuals, for those groups, but it's an ecosystem in that they're all important elements of a broader whole. And each one complements the other. There's no one way of working within the framework of a social movement. There are many strategies, many different groups, and it's building alliances across these differences that ultimately might work towards the goal of justice and liberation. One of the many elements of this ecosystem is the participation of Jewish activists. Now, Jewish activists have been involved in Palestine solidarity organizing really since the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel. As long as there has been a State of Israel and as long as there has been Zionism, there has been Jewish descent towards both of those things, and that's no different today. The activism that we see today is based on previous iterations of Jewish descent towards Israel and Zionism, and very much the activists of today, they're not just standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before them, but they're really learning from the lessons of previous generations. In terms of the intersectionality, the activists that I worked with understand that the liberation of Palestine that the freedom and justice for Palestinians is deeply woven into the fabric of other justice issues that exist in the world. It's connected to queer liberation and to climate change and to racial justice, and that all of these struggles uh, are connected in certain ways. Dr. King talks about it from the letter in a Birmingham jail that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that really points to certain elements of the intersectionality of this movement. But also, people, young American Jews in particular, are coming to Palestine solidarity activism sometimes from other social movements and justice struggles. They worked for climate change, or they were in union organizing, or they were doing fossil fuel divestment campaigns on their campus. And it's through that activism that they learned that actually the struggle for justice in Palestine is deeply connected. And so they sort of cut their teeth in activist movements in other contexts and used those lessons that they learned there to join in the broader Palestine solidarity movement. Now, when we go to 2014, there's an important sort of story that we can share with the development of If Not Now, the one of what has become one of the most important and prominent Jewish activist organizations in the United States today. In 2014, there's a truly cataclysmic war in Gaza, and there's young American Jews reading the news, seeing the destruction, going on Facebook and seeing certain images or videos that they had never seen before, logging on to Twitter, seeing the same thing, and sharing that with their friends. And all of a sudden, they're wondering, wait a minute, this is Israel doing this? This is the Israeli military causing this type of damage and suffering? That doesn't match up. This seems very disproportionate. And there was a group of activists in New York who decided they wanted to get together to have some type of a public-facing action to show Jewish solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. And they got together to say Kaddish, which is the Jewish mourner's prayer for the lives lost in Israel and in Gaza. This is a really important transformational moment where you have a group of young American Jews saying Kaddish for Palestinian lives. And it's important that they're using Jewish language here, Jewish ritual and Jewish prayer, because to get back to Peter Beinart and Dov Waxman, instead of running away from their Jewishness, they're doubling down on their Jewish identities in this direct action and saying, we're doing this in solidarity with Palestinians because we are Jewish. And that is a really remarkable moment that shifts things for young American Jews. Just 2 years later, we see Donald Trump is elected. And there have been, prior to that, all of these different elements of violence that bring American Jews into the Palestine solidarity movement. Young American, older millennials, for many of them, this was the 2008-2009 war in Gaza. For younger ones, this was 2014 war in Gaza, which was the start of If Not Now. But when Donald Trump was elected, it really shook the core of a lot of the American Jewish community. They said, wait a minute, we did not think that this was possible. We did not think that this would happen. Here's someone who campaigned on all of these things just specifically to the Middle East or to Israel, Palestine, such as moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which goes against previous U.S. foreign policy in the region. And they thought that none of this could possibly ever happen. And that really motivated people to get involved because they saw that social movement organizing doesn't only happen on the left. They looked at the success of the Tea Party in the United States, for example, which was right-wing social movement organizing and their successes and the ways that that led to the Trump campaign victory. They said we really need to focus our support now towards a social movement that is more in line with our values. And so you see young American Jews showing up at airports to demonstrate against the so-called Muslim ban. You see you see American Jewish communities getting involved with climate change activism. And so here again, we see the intersectionality and the ways that the Trump electoral victory brought people into multiple social movements. And one of those was the movement for justice in Palestine. And they got involved in Palestine solidarity activism, among other things.
I want to move to chapter 2, which, in my view, is my favorite, but for reasons that are personal, very much like the chapter itself is very personal. I can relate to with plenty of stories. When you discuss questions about unlearning Zionism and recognizing indoctrination. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little about yourself, about your travels through the West Bank that seem to be the breaking point for many, as we mentioned earlier. And also, if you can tell us a little bit more about Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian activists and how their stories relate to American Jews and how these stories may foster change.
Chapter 2 certainly is the most personal of these chapters. I will very openly admit that this was the hardest one for me to write, and also the one I was most nervous about including in the book, because thinking about unlearning Zionism is deeply painful and deeply personal. And I really put myself into the story, but I only put myself into the story and share my own process of unlearning Zionism because it very much is representative of the process of unlearning Zionism that so many young American Jews go through that moves them towards Palestine solidarity activism. But also, it's this process of unlearning Zionism doesn't just make them passive supporters, but really active participants in this organizing. As I mentioned at the start, I very much grew up in this normative Jewish environment, Reform household. Zionism was core to my Jewish upbringing. I often like to say that I was taught to question everything in my world. And while maybe I was also taught to question Zionism, I didn't know that there was an option there. I write about how I felt like the simple son in the Passover Seder. In the Passover Seder, there's four sons. The simple son is the one who doesn't know how to ask. I felt like I didn't know how to ask, and it's not that I didn't know how to ask. I didn't even know what questions to ask with regards to Israel or Zionism or Palestinians. It wasn't until I could share a myriad of personal stories of how I was indoctrinated into a particular pro-Israel viewpoint through summer camps and school and a semester-long Zionist youth program that I did in Jerusalem when I was a sophomore in high school. But what really started to shake things for me was when I was participating as a leader in a Birthright Israel program in July 2006 during the onset of the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. in the aftermath of that experience, I only saw people demonizing Hezbollah and the people of Lebanon and Muslims and Arabs, and I was very confused. How could people only be talking in this very derogatory way towards this massive group of people? And I was like, I need to learn more. Why are people saying this? What's Israel doing? What's Israel's role in all of this? Are other people saying the same thing about Israel and Israelis and Jews that people I was surrounded with are saying about people in Lebanon? And that led me towards learning about Palestinians. It was like, oh, there's a connection there. And I didn't even know about that. Of course, I knew about Palestinians, but I didn't know much. And I started to learn a lot. And then I started to meet Palestinians, and they started to tell me their stories. And I started to read Palestinian scholarship and Palestinian literature and listen to Palestinian music. I was like, oh, there's a whole nother story here. I was only taught one thing, and that's where we see the danger of a single story, to reduce another people to an enemy, so to speak. And so I then went to East Jerusalem and to the West Bank. By the time I started doing this work, Gaza was already closed off, and I couldn't access Gaza. And I was able to bear witness to occupation and apartheid firsthand, and that opened my eyes to a lot of the myths that I was taught, and to the impacts of Israeli state violence and the policies of apartheid on Palestinians. And the deeper in that I got to learning about these things, the more I built alliances with Palestinians, both in the United States and those on the ground in Palestine, both in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. And I continued to learn from them. What I discovered in building these alliances is that there were actually a lot of Palestinian and Jewish Israeli activists who had gone through similar processes of personal transformation. And I had been studying peace studies, and there's this theory in peace studies that conflict transformation requires personal transformation. That without widespread personal transformation, we can't get to the next stage in conflict transformation. And I learned from people who were the most impacted from this conflict, from the violence on the ground in Israel and Palestine, that personal transformation is possible, but it's also a necessary step towards building the alliances that might ultimately free us all and lead to justice in the region. So I met Palestinians who were former combatants or whose homes had been demolished, who had been very much working within the framework of co-resistance activism, which maybe we'll talk about in a moment. Same with Jewish Israelis who had lost loved ones in the conflict, who were doing similar things. And then I realized that this was part of what had happened to me. I went through this process of transformation, and in doing research, I noticed that there were really countless people who had gone through a similar transformation, learning from the actors on the ground most impacted by this. And that is one of the things that helped them to unlearn Zionism, but get them to become active participants in this movement for justice.
And I really want to move to talk about the question of co-resistance, which I think is very important and very interesting. So you tell the story of En Al-Beida, which is a spring in the West Bank, close to Hebron, so that you can locate this place, geographically speaking, on a map. And you use this example to talk about joint Palestinian-Jewish resistance in Israel-Palestine. And so I was wondering if you can talk more about the idea of co-resistance, but also if you can connect it to the other idea that you discuss in the book, that is of coexistence activity, how they differ from each other, And why are these important?
I participated in this direct action in Ain al-Baida, which is in the South Hebron Hills in Masafar Yatta, which is a series of villages, of Palestinian villages in the South Hebron Hills under the threat of demolition. I participated in this action with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, who brings Jewish activists from around the world to engage in this type of co-resistance direct action with Palestinians on the ground that's intended to do two things. One, materially, and two, symbolically, uh, shift the status quo on the ground. We helped rebuild this spring that had been the source of water for generations for Palestinians in the area. But when settlers moved in, they started to use that spring as a mikvah, a ritual bath, but also just as a place to hang out and swim and bathe. And that dirtied the waters, and the settlers started to intimidate Palestinians. So they hadn't been able to draw water from that spring in about 15, 20 years. So we went to help rebuild it, and Palestinian farmers came and drew water from that well for the first time in 15 years. And it was a really powerful and profound joint solidarity action that symbolically showed that there are Jews and Palestinians who refuse to be enemies, who are willing to work together in the service of materially improving the lives of Palestinians on the ground in the West Bank. It also is an action that does not have a great ending while the Palestinians were able to get their water there that day. As soon as the activists left, the settlers returned and destroyed the spring yet again and continued to swim in it, dirtying the waters. So that really, I think, shows the limits of co-resistance activism as well as the values. Now, co-resistance is a form of activism where Palestinians and Jews resist policies of apartheid and occupation collectively through direct action on the ground in Palestinian communities. Co-resistance is always led by Palestinians, and they always invite Jewish Israelis or international Jews to participate in these as a way to show that it is that a shared future rooted in equality and justice between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians is possible. It's modeling on the ground what a future might look like. And the Jewish partners are invited to participate by Palestinians based on shared political commitments. If they have these shared political commitments towards justice, then that is what might lead Palestinian communities to invite these Jewish activists to participate. I'll get to the coexistence piece in a moment, but I want to say that part of the value of Jewish participation in these co-resistance actions is that as Jews, they are able to leverage their privilege in the framework of Israeli apartheid, where Jews are privileged. Jews have the rights. So when you bring Jewish activists, it is less likely for the military or for settlers to attack the Palestinians. And they're able to help to de-arrest Palestinians, use their bodies to protect Palestinians. Again, this is only temporary because if these activists sort of parachute in, they come in for a short amount of time for a direct action. What happens when they leave is that the violence returns and continues. I still believe, though there are limitations, that it is a profound form of activism because what it does is it rights some of the wrongs, so to speak, of this other model of coexistence. So I came of age during the Oslo process, in which it seemed as though it was a very hopeful time in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that there might be the possibilities for peace. During Oslo, there were tremendous resources put into what was known as coexistence activities. Coexistence means that Palestinians and Jewish Israelis can live together. They can coexist. And these programs were things like summer camps or orchestras or dialogue groups, encounter groups where Jewish Israelis and Palestinians would come together and do these things, or they'd play sports and show the world that, or their communities, that they can indeed coexist, exist together. What became clear is that these coexistence programs were insufficient in their mission because they failed to properly address the imbalance in the dynamic of power between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. That though maybe in that room, it might seem, if they were having a dialogue, that they were equals, what that room was a microcosm for the world outside that was not existing in a vacuum, and the power imbalance that existed outside also existed in that room. So as Oslo crumbled, as the despair of the Second Intifada took hold, there were groups of Palestinian activists who said, Khalas, no more coexistence. This is not working. It didn't work for us. It didn't only help things get better, things actually have gotten worse. And we want to move to a different form of activism, and that's where co-resistance emerged. Because co-resistance takes these dynamics of power very seriously, addresses them front and center, and since it's Palestinian-led, they set the conditions for the activism, and they're asking their Jewish comrades to leverage their privilege in the service of symbolically and materially helping to improve the status quo. And ultimately, I believe the goal of co-resistance is coexistence so that Palestinians and Jewish Israelis will live together. The means towards that end are dramatically different and take the dynamics of power into account in a much more robust and serious way.
I would love to share your optimism in this, but as a cynical historian, I found myself often questioning whether there's actually a way forward. But you're right to mention that pattern has to change. I mean, this idea of thinking coexistence obviously didn't work, and it's through co-resistance that it's possible to re-envision a new form of coexistence. I have a couple of questions left, and I really want to touch a very, very touchy subject, BDS. Now, first of all, for those who may not be familiar with the movement, I was wondering if you can define the BDS and contextualizing it within the context of American Jews. And perhaps you can share with us the story of Jewish Voice for Peace and the role of Jews, which I must say is often demonized, within the BDS movement.
BDS stands for Boycott, Divestments, and Sanctions. In 2005, Palestinian civil society was inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, which we were referencing apartheid earlier. And Palestinian civil society called on people of conscience around the world to join them in putting nonviolent pressure on Israel to comply with international law by meeting three demands. I'll get to those three demands in a moment, but it's very important to point out two really important things here. First is that BDS is a nonviolent movement. They're using nonviolent strategies that have been successful in other historical, cultural, and political contexts around the world. And second is to point out that these three demands are merely about pressuring Israel to comply with international law. And it's to comply with international law in three regards, three demands. First is ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall that was constructed starting in the early 2000s. Second is by recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And the third is by respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties. That was stipulated in United Nations Resolution 194. These three demands point to the three different parts of the Palestinian people, which have been fractured by the state of Israel. So the first demand is about Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. The second one is about Palestinian citizens of Israel living inside Israel. And the third one, with regards to the right of return of refugees, is about the Palestinian diaspora, those living outside of Palestine. This is a very touchy subject, in part because BDS has become a red line for activists inside the Jewish community. Those who participate in BDS activism are often ostracized from their Jewish communities. And because BDS activism has been criminalized, and activists who have engaged in these tactics have been doxxed, have lost job opportunities, have had all kinds of things taken away from them because they have the chutzpah to engage in a movement for Palestinian justice and liberation that on the one hand is inherently nonviolent, and on the other hand has been deemed by Israel and pro-Israel supporters as anti-Semitic. Again, I want to point out the significance of this as a nonviolent movement. All forms of Palestinian activism have been criminalized by Israel or its supporters. So they can't engage in armed struggle because that's unacceptable. They can't engage in demonstrations on the ground because then they're met with repression from the Israeli military, and that's deemed as unacceptable. So Palestinian civil society said, okay, we're going to engage in these three strategies of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and we will get international support that way. But of course, now the international community that has criminalized it, or Israel has criminalized it, or a bunch of states in the United States have criminalized boycotting or divestment campaigns against Israel. And therefore, what they're saying is actually even nonviolent activism and resistance is unacceptable. So at the same time, I should point out that the BDS movement has become very much so the largest movement for Palestinian liberation in history, and so that's quite significant, I think we should say. Now, with regards to Jewish participation, Jewish Voice for Peace, which was started in 1999, has become the most prominent Jewish organization that works for and supports BDS as a tactic. They have been very, very involved, and Jewish participation in BDS campaigns and BDS activism is very significant because the primary critique of the BDS movement is that it is deemed anti-Semitic. The pro-Israel activists, those who are against BDS, have weaponized anti-Semitism to say that this is an anti-Semitic movement. And so the presence of Jewish Voice for Peace or Jewish activists is very important to deflect from these accusations of anti-Semitism, because when Jewish activists are involved in BDS campaigns, they're there to say, hold on, It's not anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionism is very different from anti-Semitism. The critique of Israel should be and is on the table, just like the critique of any state. And all we're doing is asking Israel to comply with international law with these three demands. This is against the state, not against Jewish people. So when you have Jewish Voice for Peace and Jewish activists involved in these campaigns, it's really significant, both again, symbolically and materially, to deflect from these accusations of anti-Semitism, and that helps the movement be more successful. And we have seen that, especially in the last year, that divestment campaigns have spread across the United States on campuses that are now seeing this as a very viable strategy to pressure Israel to comply with international law and to pressure universities to divest from companies that are profiting off of this catastrophic war.
In the conclusion, you are going back to the beginning, 2021. And you just mentioned that. You once again make it clear that Judaism and Zionism should be separated. But as we will know, currently we see the opposite. There's a tendency to conflate and put them together. Can you draw some conclusion for us?
I think that it's really important to also return to Peter Beinart, that his forewarning has come true, that as Israel moves further and further to the right, as Israel becomes more illiberal, as its policies of apartheid and occupation move more and more into the realm of permanent and catastrophic in their violence against Palestinians, American Jews will be less and less likely to support that state. And instead of engaging with Jewish institutions and organizations that support that, they'll be moving away from that. So one of the key conclusions, I think, is that American Jewish institutions need to adapt, need to change. Jewish survival has been predicated on adaptability for millennia. And so if the American Jewish community is to survive, again, it must adapt to the changing conditions of the social, cultural, and political milieu surrounding support for the state of Israel and for policies of Zionism. If the mainstream American Jewish institutions, if the American Jewish establishment does not adapt, it will risk irrelevance, especially with younger Jews, millennial and Gen Z Jews, and who knows what will happen in the future. And there are numerous sort of data points to support this. The first one of many is this open letter from rabbinical students that I write about in the introduction that we talked about. And the second that I write about in the conclusion is a group called Avodah, which is the Jewish Service Corps. It's a social justice organization for young Jews. And they had a reckoning again in 2021 when all of these alumni from the organization said, hold on, you cannot keep supporting Israel. You're teaching us these social justice organizing principles. We need you to uphold these. Otherwise, we're not going to continue to support your organization. So we see time and time again that if organizations and institutions will not adapt to the changing nature of Israel's radical shift to the right, then they will lose the support of young American Jews. Now, one final conclusion is that, again, to point to the critical engagement piece, this does not mean that American Jews will stop being involved with American Jewish life. On the contrary, they are going to continue to be involved. They will just create their own institutions, their own organizations, gather with their friends for Shabbat dinners and to engage in Jewish prayer or Jewish rituals and to create Jewish community that are rooted in shared political commitments to towards justice for Palestinians. And that points to me towards a future of American Jewish life that is more inclusive of these young activists who are doubling down on their Jewish identities in the Palestine solidarity movement, saying our safety as Jews is deeply intertwined with the safety and security of Palestinians. And that is the future that we want, that everybody does better when everybody does better, us, them, all of us.
I must ask, as a last question, how do you see the current war in Gaza impacting young American Jews?
Yeah, it's been extraordinarily impactful. And as we've talked about, the 2008 Gaza war, 2014, 2021, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, this war is also a cataclysmic moment. This is another mobilizing moment that is bringing more and more and more people into Palestine solidarity activism, forcing people to move away from their support of Israel, move away from their Zionism. Yet again, people are unlearning Zionism as they witness the catastrophic violence that the Israeli military is wreaking on Gaza. And I also want to say that we have not really seen anything new emerge since this war began and since the attacks of October 7th. On the contrary, all we have seen is that everything has just moved out into the open in more ways. And the way I like to describe it is that everything that was before still exists. It's just that now everything is on steroids. Everything is bigger and more intense. The violence, the protests, the disagreements, the conversations, everything is just more intense. So I think that we're going to see this being another mobilizing moment that has really catapulted more people to become active participants in Palestine solidarity organizing.
This was Oren Kroll-Zeldin, author of Unsettled, American Jews and the Movement for Justice in Palestine, published by New York University Press in 2024. Oren, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.